He soaked all the planes he got in the bathtub, carefully peeled off the tail logos, and stuck them on forged checks. Then, dressed in a fake pilot uniform, he confidently walked into the bank. When the teller was about to check the check, he quickly started flattering her, saying, "You look really beautiful." The bank teller was so flattered by his compliments that she completely forgot to check the necessary details. This is how he successfully swindled his first sum of money. From then on, he became unstoppable. In just over a year, he managed to scam over $4 million from various banks. And he was only 16 years old at the time. He is the most audacious con artist in American history. He once posed as a pilot, traveling for free to over 20 countries, covering a distance of more than 3 million kilometers. He also pretended to be a doctor, and even became the head of a hospital. He even posed as a lawyer and became an assistant to the state prosecutor. Despite being pursued by the FBI, he always manages to escape with ease. To understand how he does it, we need to look back at the deceptions life has dealt him. Frank once had a happy family. His father was successful in his career and had even been commended by the mayor. His mother was graceful and loving towards him. His parents had a great relationship, and his father often boasted to Frank, "I defeated over 200 competitors to win your mom's heart." Frank thought this happiness would last forever, until this morning. Frank's father suddenly woke him up and took him to rent a suit. But it was too early, and the shop owner refused to open the door. As the owner was about to leave, his father quickly called out to her and calmly pulled out a cheap necklace. "I just found something in the parking lot. It must have slipped off your neck." With that, he successfully rented an expensive suit for his son. Then, he had his son dress up as a luxury car driver. This impressive display made the bank manager come out to greet them personally. They visited every bank that day, but because the father had evaded taxes, no bank was willing to take the risk of lending to him. Frank then realized that his father was bankrupt. His family fell from grace, losing not only their luxury car, but also their big mansion. The whole family moved into a small, rundown apartment. On Frank's 16th birthday, his father gave him a $25 account and a checkbook with 50 blank checks. With a check, you have everything and can reach the top in one step. However, what he never expected was that Frank really used checks to reach the top. Without the family's financial support, Frank had to transfer from a prestigious school to a regular one. Unexpectedly, on his first day at school, accustomed to wearing his noble school uniform, he was bullied by the school tyrant. Not only that, the bully mocked him for looking like a substitute teacher. But this remark seemed to awaken Frank. He wrote his name on the blackboard and then shouted at the noisy and chaotic class. Surprisingly, the students believed him, immediately stopped making noise, and sat down obediently. To get back at the bully who humiliated him, he dragged the person to the podium and punished him by making him read the text. His calm demeanor instantly intimidated everyone. Even the real substitute teacher was scared off by a single sentence from him. By the time the school discovered Frank, he had already been teaching French to the class for a whole week. During this period, he not only taught lessons and assigned homework, but even held a parent-teacher meeting. If he had been discovered any later, he would have taken the students to visit a bakery in France. While Frank's parents were being scolded in the office, he was outside helping others. He quickly noticed that the note in the girl's hand was a fake. He took the opportunity to teach her to fold it in the middle, as that's how parents usually hand over notes to their kids. Frank's talent for forgery is truly innate. His mother was extremely disappointed as she walked out of the office, but his father's attitude was completely different. However, when Frank returned home that day, he unexpectedly discovered something unusual about his mother. He opened the door and found a strange man in the house. His mother, looking flustered, claimed the man was there for business. But Frank knew that real business doesn't require closed doors. The man nonchalantly picked up his coat and was about to leave when Frank called out to him. He found a suit button on the sofa. The man casually took the button and said with a smile, "I might have accidentally brushed it off." Frank was silent. The lie was too clumsy. After the man left, Frank remained gloomy. His mother pretended to be calm and made some excuses, but she eventually realized that Frank was not a fool. He thought that if he didn't mention what happened that day, everything would remain calm. However, another strange man's suit appeared at home. This time, the suit belonged to a lawyer. The lawyer told him that his parents were getting a divorce and that he had to choose who he would live with in the future. Frank was stunned. His once loving parents were now going their separate ways. The strong sense of unreality made him feel disoriented. He quickly ran out of the house, trying to escape the harsh reality. With only $25, he took a train to New York, beginning a life of wandering. But soon, he ran out of money. To get money quickly, he started forging checks. Use a small knife to scrape off part of the number on the check. Then, use an eraser to remove any excess marks. Next, use a pen to modify it into a new number. Cut out a stranger's name from the newspaper and carefully stick it onto the check with tweezers. The bank clerk saw through it immediately. He tried multiple banks, pretending to be pitiful or sick, but the result was always the same. Just when he was feeling dejected, the appearance of a pilot gave him a sudden inspiration. At that time, pilots held a very high status. They were always surrounded by graceful flight attendants, could stay in luxury hotels due to their job, and were admired and respected by everyone. Even children would ask for their autographs. So, Frank secretly decided that he must become a pilot. But he wasn't going to spend years taking exams. Instead, he pretended to be a student journalist. He interviewed a big shot from the largest airline at the time, asking a series of essential details required for pilots. The unsuspecting executive revealed everything, sharing both permissible and confidential information. Frank learned that a pilot's license is extremely important. Before leaving, Frank managed to trick the executive into giving him his pilot's license under the pretext of photocopying it for a newspaper. After solidifying his theoretical foundation, Frank began practical operations. He first called Pan Am Airlines, pretending to be a pilot who had lost his uniform. After getting the address of a nearby supplier, he went there to have a uniform custom-made. The supplier neither accepts checks nor cash. Frank just needs to write down his employee number, and the amount will be deducted from his salary account. Conveniently, the boss's pilot license has his employee number. This way, Frank easily got a uniform and wore the pilot's uniform. He walked down the street with his head held high, basking in the admiring glances of passers-by. At this moment, he felt on top of the world. With the added prestige of his uniform, cashing checks became much easier. Even the lobby manager, who used to treat him coldly, immediately changed his attitude. Additionally, he discovered that this uniform was like a universal ATM, granting him access everywhere. Upon learning that personal checks could be cashed for up to $100 while payroll checks could be cashed for $300, he immediately started studying payroll checks once he got home. First, he used a printer to make a one-to-one copy of a check. Then, he carefully removed the logo from an airline model and meticulously attached it to the fake check. After drying it by placing it in a book, he confidently walked into the bank. He specifically targets young and pretty female tellers. While the teller is busy checking, he distracts her with sweet talk. His slick moves actually lead to a successful cash out. He then started mass production to quickly exchange for more money. He arrived at the bank early, but it wasn't open yet. However, he received an even more important piece of news. Airport staff could directly help with the exchange. At the airport, he discovered that pilots could fly for free on any company flight. So, he boarded a plane and entered the cockpit for the first time. Although he was usually very brave, he couldn't help but feel a bit nervous this time. Fortunately, he answered all the captain's professional questions fluently. Finally, with the help of a flight attendant, he found his seat and sat down. After the plane stabilized, he went to the back to find the flight attendant again. Mimicking his father, he took out a cheap gold-plated necklace and said, "I think this necklace must have slipped off your neck."
Nahi.
In this way, he and the flight attendant experienced their first growth in the air. Along with their growth, his money also started pouring in. To make his forgery more professional, he went to the bank and specifically chose a naive girl. With his handsome face and uniform, he not only won her over but also successfully extracted information about check manufacturing and circulation. Upon learning that the check codes were printed using a specialized printer, he spent a lot of money to buy one that was previously used for printing check codes. With this, his forged checks would be even more convincing. With this, Frank's life started to go smoothly. As he became successful, he not only invited his father to dine at a high-end restaurant, but also gifted him a flashy convertible. He hoped his father could use the car to win back his mother's heart. However, his father had already become a defaulter and was restricted from all high-end consumption. To avoid unnecessary suspicion, he declined his son's kind offer. He asked his son where the next flight was headed. When his son said Hollywood, he knew it was all a lie. Instead of criticizing, the father supported and praised him. The father loved telling the story of two mice. Two mice fell into a bucket of cream. The first mouse gave up early and drowned. The second mouse never gave up and struggled hard, eventually churning the cream into butter and climbing out. The father always saw himself as the second mouse and hoped Frank would be the same. But what he didn't know was that behind the mouse, FBI agent Carl is the cat behind Frank. At that time, the codes at the bottom of American checks represented different regions nationwide. If a check from Region B was used in Region A, it had to be sent back to Region B for processing, which usually took about 2 weeks. In other words, every time Frank issued a misencoded check, it took the bank 2 weeks to realize it was fake. Using this method, Frank swindled millions of dollars in less than a year. He cashed fake checks all over the place, and these checks circulated through banks nationwide. However, since economic crimes were not common at the time, the methods for counterfeiting and detecting fake checks were not advanced. As a result, no one except Carl paid attention to this case, so he had to work with 2 unruly agents. Following the trail of the checks, Carl tracked them down bit by bit. One day, he discovered the fake checks at a hotel. After confirming Frank's room, Carl burst in with his gun, shouting FBI. However, the room was empty, except for the counterfeit tools on the table, indicating he was in the right place. Just as he was puzzled, a noise came from the bathroom. Frank calmly walked out. Facing Carl's gun, he remained calm. He lied, claiming to be from the CIA, and also chasing the check forger. Unfortunately, you're a bit late. The suspect has already been taken away by my colleague. As an investigator, Carl wouldn't easily believe him, so he asked to see Frank's ID. Without hesitation, Frank handed over his wallet. But when Carl was about to verify it, Frank started to divert his attention. He pointed to 2 people outside the window and said, Those were actually my colleagues and the suspect. In reality, they were just a father and son living next door. When he was going upstairs, he happened to run into them. To make Carl believe him more, he even shouted, "Don't let the police ruin the crime scene." Although Frank appeared calm on the surface, he was actually very nervous inside. While drinking water to calm his nerves, he decided to check Carl's ID as well. After pretending to examine it, he claimed he needed to go downstairs to submit the evidence. He even refused to take back his wallet from Carl, making Carl think he would definitely return soon. Once Frank left, Carl let out a sigh of relief and sat on the bed. He couldn't believe how easy this case was, but something felt off. When he opened Frank's wallet, he found only snack labels and no ID. Realizing he had been tricked, Carl saw Frank running to his car with all the documents. Furious, he threw the wallet and cursed loudly. The boss advised Carl to stop investigating further. "You've been in the field for over 12 years and just published a book on fraud prevention. Sooner or later, you'll be promoted to department head. If you persist and find nothing, you might lose your qualification." But Carl is confident he will succeed because he has seen Frank's face and scammers fear being exposed. On the other side, Frank, who successfully escaped, disguised himself as a reporter again and interviewed the big boss of the airline. The boss also complained to him about the sky pirate who was exploiting the airline, saying it was driving him crazy. Frank felt a bit proud after hearing this. He was proud that as a novice, he had managed to fool the airlines so thoroughly. Not only that, but his glorious deeds were also reported in the newspapers, and he was even called the 007 of the skies. This greatly satisfied his youthful vanity. To get closer to the image of 007 in the movies, he not only tailored several suits identical to 007's, but also bought a silver gray sports car just like the one in the film. With this outfit and his striking appearance, he immediately attracted a homeless beauty upon entering the hotel. They quickly hit it off and went to a room. Just as they were about to get intimate, the woman asked him to pay first. After some back-and-forth bargaining, they settled on $1,000. Frank had a $1,000 check in his hand but took out a $1,400 one, claiming he had no change. He anticipated that the woman would be eager to do business with him, and she generously said, "No problem, I can give you change." And so it went. He used a fake check to not only get $400 in cash, but also a night with a beautiful woman. On Christmas Eve, Carl, who was working overtime at the office, suddenly received a call from Frank. Frank first apologized for his previous deceitful actions and then claimed he was in room 3113 of a hotel in Las Vegas. However, Carl thought Frank was playing him again. So, he didn't take his words seriously at all. Instead, he raised his own question. "Why were you so sure I wouldn't look at your wallet?" Frank then shared his father's theory about the Yankees baseball team. Their success wasn't because the players were exceptionally skilled, but because of their unique pinstripe uniforms. Opponents often focused on their unusual attire and overlooked more important things, increasing their chances of making mistakes during the game. "When I handed you the wallet, I kept diverting your attention. By the time you noticed, it was too late. I was already downstairs." Carl was unimpressed by his explanation. Instead, more discoveries were made. Frank called not to apologize, but because he had no one to talk to on Christmas Eve. The lonely Frank was instantly hit in a sore spot. He angrily hung up the phone and left the room. And his room number was indeed 3113. It turns out he wasn't lying this time. Meanwhile, Carl laughed out loud as if he had won a battle. Soon, Carl's investigation made a major breakthrough. He discovered that all the aliases Frank used were characters from comic books. This led him to deduce that the suspect was a kid with no criminal record, which is why his fingerprints weren't in the database. Since Frank had mentioned the Yankees, Carl deduced he was from New York. He then ordered a thorough investigation of runaway boys in New York. Based on the reports, they visited each family. Before long, Carl found Frank's mother and saw the face that had once tricked him in a yearbook. The mother hadn't realized the trouble her son had caused. She quickly claimed that she would cover the amount he had swindled. When she heard it was over $1.3 million, she was stunned. Carl then approached Frank's father, who tried to cover for his son, but it was all in vain. Carl had found a letter Frank wrote to his father and discreetly noted the address. Following the address, Carl and his team arrived at an apartment, but it was already deserted. They only found a note on the wall, a Harvard Medical School diploma. Soon, Carl found out which hospital Frank was at, but once again, he was a step too late. During this time, the lonely yet wealthy Frank had been living a Gatsby-like life in Atlanta. However, this young Gatsby was not content with solitude. He accidentally met a girl named Brenda at the hospital. Seeing her cry after being scolded by her boss, looking so pitiful with her braces, he thought about pretending to be a doctor again. After all, in the pilot industry, he had already become a bit too flashy. Back at his place, Frank resumed his expertise in graphic arts. He cut out a Harvard emblem from a book and, using his superb forgery skills, printed a seal and affixed it to a diploma. Just like that, he became a top graduate of Harvard Medical School. Consequently, he easily secured a night shift doctor position, thinking that the night shift wouldn't have many patients and would be relatively easy to handle. In his spare time, he would watch medical films to learn some knowledge and to study the way doctors speak and their tone. However, he spent most of his time in the office talking with Brenda. But one day, while they were deeply engaged, the hospital suddenly received an emergency patient. Faced with the gruesome scene, Frank pretended to be calm and asked the interns questions, cleverly delegating all the work to them. He then returned to his office and threw up violently. It turned out that he not only lacked professional knowledge, but also had a fear of blood. Frank never imagined that being a doctor would be so tough. He secretly vowed to change his career immediately, and soon he found an opportunity to do so. That day, Brenda suddenly started crying in bed, saying she had an abortion before and wasn't a good girl. Her lawyer father kicked her out of the house because of it. Hearing this, lawyer Frank had a sudden idea. He immediately said he didn't care about Brenda's past at all and proposed to marry her and go with her to meet her parents. So when Carl found the hospital, Frank had already resigned and gone to Brenda's hometown. He even met Brenda's parents to smoothly get help from her father. When asked which hospital he would work at after marriage, Frank directly expressed his intention to switch careers to become a lawyer. He even claimed to have graduated from Berkeley Law School. Unexpectedly, this made-up school turned out to be Brenda's father's alma mater. After asking a few questions, Brenda's father quickly saw through Frank's lies. Afterwards, he approached Frank alone to ask about his true identity. Realizing he couldn't deceive the old fox, he confessed, "I'm neither a doctor nor a lawyer. In fact, I'm nothing. I'm just a man deeply in love with your daughter." Unexpectedly, this sincere gesture moved Brenda's father. In his youth, he was also penniless and won Brenda's mother with his courage, eventually making a life for himself. He greatly admired Frank's bravery and encouraged him to keep it up. Later, with Brenda's father's help, not only did he successfully obtain his law certificate, but he also became an assistant to a state prosecutor. During this time, he lived in Brenda's home, where the strong family atmosphere deeply moved him. Especially when he saw Brenda's parents washing dishes together, it always reminded him of the scenes of his own parents dancing gracefully in the living room. This made him, a former con artist, consider turning over a new leaf. On Christmas Day, he met his father again and excitedly said, "I'm about to get married, and I've made a lot of money. Not only can I make sure you and Mom attend my wedding in style, but I can also help you return to the good old days." However, his father replied, "Your mother has remarried. The old days are gone, and now the FBI is watching you." Frank couldn't believe it. In just 2 years, his mother had left him and his father. He could buy everything with money, but he couldn't buy back his old home. Frank wanted his father to persuade him to quit his life of crime. He now wanted to settle down and start his own family. But his father believed that Frank could never quit. "Once you take the first step, you are destined to keep going," he said. Hearing this, Frank left, angry and sad. It's Christmas Eve again. Carl has been waiting for Frank's call. This time, Frank takes the initiative to make peace with Carl. "I'm about to get married. I hope you can let me live an ordinary life." But having already committed fraud amounting to over $4 million, how could he possibly live an ordinary life? He is like a car speeding on the highway with failed brakes. Either it crashes or he gets caught. Carl quickly found the place based on the recent engagement information. Sensing something was wrong, Frank had no choice but to confess everything to Brenda. He told her the time and place to elope, then immediately escaped through the window. By the time Carl arrived at their room, only a sobbing Brenda was left. 2 days later, Frank arrived at the agreed airport. Brenda also arrived as promised. But just as Frank got out of the car to greet her, he noticed someone whispering in Brenda's ear. Alert, he immediately got back into the car. Upon closer observation, he realized the entire airport was filled with plainclothes police. It turned out that in those 2 days, they had already gotten Brenda to talk. Frank could only leave in disappointment. Although Carl didn't catch Frank by waiting, he firmly believed Frank would fly abroad from the airport. So, he deployed many officers there, waiting for Frank to show up. Meanwhile, Frank had already planned his escape. He first forged a passport for himself, then put on a pilot's uniform and resumed his old tricks. Posing as an airline pilot, he went to a women's college to recruit flight attendants in the name of the company. Finally, he walked into the airport hall with 8 stunning blonde beauties. As expected, the police's attention was entirely drawn to the beauties, completely ignoring Frank, who was hiding among them. Additionally, Frank paid a passerby to wear a uniform and impersonate him outside the airport. Not only did he successfully deceive everyone, but he also outsmarted Carl once again. By the time Carl realized he was deceived, Frank had already fled the country by plane. For the next 7 months, there was no news of Frank until Carl tracked him down again. Frank had been using forged checks all over the world. In just over half a year, Frank's check forging skills had become so advanced that even airlines couldn't tell the difference between real and fake checks. As a result, there were no crime reports related to Frank during this period. Carl suspected that Frank was running out of checks. He will definitely continue printing before he runs out. Watching the almost indistinguishable fake checks, Carl decides to arrest Frank at the place where he makes the checks. After consulting with the old craftsmen who print checks for the bank, Carl concludes that Frank's base is in France. The old craftsmen believe that the reason Frank can make such realistic fakes is that he got hold of old equipment discarded by European banks. Hearing the keyword Europe, Carl immediately remembered that during his last visit to Frank's mother, she mentioned that France's Monza was where she and Frank's father met and fell in love. Frank is a family-oriented person, so even if he fled abroad, he would definitely go to places related to his parents. It was another Christmas Eve. Carl arrives alone at a factory in Munsaw, where Frank is busy printing checks. Instead of panicking at Carl's arrival, Frank seems unusually excited. He might also be looking forward to Carl's arrival. Carl tries to convince Frank to wear the handcuffs, saying it will help reduce his sentence. If you choose to run, the 20 French police officers outside will catch you. Frank, who is a habitual liar, thinks Carl must be deceiving him. He asked Carl to swear in his daughter's name. Frank, believing him, took the ring and put it on himself. But when he stepped outside, he found no one there. Frank suddenly smiled with relief, thinking Carl was a fraud like him. But his smile vanished the next moment as numerous French police officers truly surrounded them. Carl, who had long admired Frank, kept telling the French police that he was voluntarily arrested. After Frank was put in the police car, Carl assured him, "I will definitely bring you back home." 2 years later, on Christmas Eve, Carl finally completed Frank's extradition paperwork. At this time, Frank was locked in a dark solitary cell, and the harsh conditions had already tortured him beyond recognition. But even so, he didn't give up struggling. He dared to escape right under the noses of the police from both countries. Unfortunately, his body couldn't hold out, and he was caught after just a few meters. To prevent any further incidents, he was kept in handcuffs and shackles throughout the journey. It wasn't until he boarded the plane back home that they finally removed his restraints. Carl suddenly asked the question that had been bothering him for a long time. How did you pass the bar exam? Frank tried to trade his small bread for an answer, but was flatly refused. As the plane was about to land, Frank requested to see his father before going to prison, but Carl informed him that his father had already passed away. Unable to bear the news, Frank broke down emotionally. Carl took him to the restroom to calm down, where the sound of sobbing could be heard. The crash echoed throughout the plane, but soon after, the noise suddenly stopped. As the plane was about to land, Carl suddenly realized something. He hurriedly opened the bathroom door and found that Frank was gone. It turns out that the toilet on the plane is connected to the cabin. Familiar with the plane structure, Frank escaped from the cabin to the landing gear. Once again, he slipped away right under Carl's nose. Frank ran all the way to his mother's house. Inside, it was warm and cozy, while outside it was bitterly cold. For the first time, he met his half-sister. Looking through the window, he saw his family enjoying a happy moment together, which plunged Frank into despair. Suddenly, the sound of sirens shattered the night. Carl and his team had caught up. This time, Frank didn't resist at all. He raised his hands and asked Carl to take him away quickly because he knew he was truly homeless now. Due to the severity of his crimes, the judge denied Frank's request to be treated as a juvenile offender and sentenced him to 12 years in the most secure prison, with solitary confinement throughout the entire period. Every Christmas, Carl visits Frank and brings him the latest comic books. To him, Frank is just a big kid. During the conversation, Carl mentioned a new check forgery case. Frank took one look at the fake check and immediately determined that the suspect was a bank teller because the numbers on the check had unique wear marks from the bank stamp. Hearing this, Carl instantly had a new idea. Soon after, he brought his boss to the prison to witness Frank's amazing skills firsthand. Frank effortlessly passed the test. Subsequently, Frank was recruited by the FBI to handle check fraud cases, with Carl acting as his guardian until he completed his sentence. And just like that, Frank transformed from a financial fraudster to a 9-to-5 civil servant. But the life of a civil servant was too dull and monotonous for him. Having been used to a carefree lifestyle, he couldn't suppress his restless heart. Especially when he saw the pilot's uniform for sale in a store, it strengthened his desire to fly away. But when he cut out his photo from the criminal record, put on the uniform, and grabbed his briefcase to leave, Carl chased after Frank once again, but this time he didn't arrest him on the spot. Instead, he chose to believe that Frank would return to work next Monday, because he firmly believed that Frank was tired of being on the run. However, by 10 a.m. on Monday, Frank still hadn't shown up. Carl was contemplating what to do if Frank really didn't return while struggling with a check forgery case. Just as he was examining a fake check with a magnifying glass, suddenly a hand snatched it away.
क्या मैं देख सकता हूँ?
Frank did not disappoint him. Seeing Frank return, Carl showed a fatherly, gentle smile. Suddenly, he persistently asked again, "How did you deceive the top bar examiners?" This time, Frank didn't hide the truth and answered honestly, "I didn't cheat. I just passed the exam easily after 2 weeks of study."
तुम्हारा मतलब ये यहीं के लड़के हैं?
Catch Me If You Can is a crime film directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, released in 2002. The film is based on a true story. Frank once impersonated a pilot and flew 2 million miles for free. He also posed as a doctor and worked as a pediatric intern supervisor. Additionally, he served as an assistant chief prosecutor. During this time, he used forged checks to swindle around $4 million in cash. And all of this happened before his 19th birthday. When he was arrested, everyone thought he was the youngest and boldest con artist in American history. By the time the film was released in 2002, the real-life Frank had been married for 26 years and had 3 sons. Since his release from prison in 1974, he has been assisting the FBI in capturing financial fraudsters, delving into related cases, and becoming a master in anti-counterfeiting and anti-fraud. He even designed the world's universal security check. Frank himself made a cameo in the film as the French police officer who went to arrest Leonardo DiCaprio's character. Most of the plot in the film is based on Frank's real experiences. However, the process of his capture was not as complicated, and there was no intense battle of wits. In reality, he was caught due to a simple mistake. A police officer thought he looked like a wanted criminal and called out his name as a test. Frank instinctively turned his head and got caught. Having deceived hundreds of people, he never expected to be tricked by such an old-fashioned method. Although Frank is a notorious thief, it's hard to hate him. Deep down, he's just a kid who values family. Everything he does is to reunite his parents and restore his broken family. His heart remains pure and kind. It was only the father's misguided direction and indulgence that led him further astray. Therefore, a child's growth requires absolutely correct guidance. Once this guiding force deviates, even a slight deviation can lead the child astray. Like a boat lost in a river, it may fall into swirling currents. Hence, we must always remain vigilant, using love, wisdom, and patience to guide and educate children so they can maintain a clear mind and choose the right path in a complex and ever-changing world.
Can use some exotic booze. There's a bar